Thank you so much. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners, the Wadi people of Dharawal Nation and the other local nations, recognising that this always has been and always will be Aboriginal land. I'd like to extend my solidarity to all the people who have come across the seas today and just say the work of Biko, Moana and many others here continue to be a huge source of strength for my work. Today, Juanita and I will provide some considerations for challenging criminology's disciplining and disciplinary boundaries in furthering the Decolonising project. Criminology ties together the concepts of disciplining and disciplinarity that are linguistically and conceptually linked. And by the way, that's a picture from Juanita's project, Social and Cultural Resilience for Mothers in Prison. So discipline can be defined as the practice of training people to obey rules using punishment to correct disobedience, or rules and languages of a branch of knowledge, typically one studied in higher education. Both aspects are embedded in criminology's practice and persuasion. On the one hand, criminology seeks to discipline through controlling its objects, offenders, prisoners, at-risk persons. On the other hand, criminology seeks to enforce disciplinary boundaries through generating and perpetuating knowledge centred on police, courts, corrections, prisons and risky individuals deserving of state punishment. Foucault states that disciplinary knowledges are exercises of disciplinary power that regulate individuals through regimes of truth. While disciplines are restrictive and constraining, their survival, which we can see from criminology research, depends on the possibility of formulating new propositions ad infinitum, so long as they do not provide a counter-knowledge. In conducting research, criminologists self-police the borders of its discipline through reinforcing its discourses and rules over and over again, including in publications, at its conferences, in law reform conversations, and through public reporting. The truths of criminology are embedded in Western concepts of individual wrongs and the maintenance of rights, especially the righteousness of white privilege. And the borders of criminology are tightly guarded, as Biko says, as a control freak. Our challenge to criminology is not simply about extending its disciplinary boundaries, but about adopting a post-disciplinary approach, which is recognised, I think, in the work of many here today, both in the work of researchers and the work of activists. Post-disciplinary research has a growing recognition in the academy, and there are now regular conferences on the topic that include keynote speakers such as Linda Tuhuwai-Smith and themes such as disobedience and creativity. Post-disciplinary studies progress a critical alternative to Western disciplinary knowledge and methods. They recognise, as Jessup and Sim articulate, that disciplines establish their own intellectual hegemony through conceptual and methodological imperialism, and that post-disciplinarity requires this dismantling of Western ways of knowing and doing. Our main impetus for critiquing the disciplinary boundaries of criminologies that our research crosses a range of disciplines, including health, education, history and political economy. Also, our impetus is our collective work as activists or disruptors, particularly currently Juanita and I working with Aboriginal women at Redfern in both support and political activism. But mostly it's informed by our work with Indigenous controlled organisations and groups that render many of the topics, questions and methods associated with criminology irrelevant and often derogatory. We share the concern among speakers today that criminology reinforces notions of crime, risk, criminality and the penal, rehabilitative and restorative apparatus of the criminal justice system, with a particular role in maintaining colonial discourses, strategies and relations. It's a vehicle for governing, inferiorising and controlling sovereign Indigenous peoples. It reinforces notions of Indigenous deficit and undermines Indigenous strengths. It can turn Indigenous concerns for safety and well-being into justifications for state penal intervention. It can distort how we do research and perpetuate myths that criminal justice creates, such as focusing on subjects and issues of the criminal justice system rather than thinking about Indigenous wellbeing and safety outside of this system. And I think the borders of criminology can also stymie disruptive activism by focusing on criminology's norms. For example, United States abolitionist Angela Davis at this year's Sisters Inside conference challenged us as activists to imagine the possibility of a world without prison. This was matched with other speakers calling on us to imagine the possibility of a world without police or criminal justice. But what would this world really look like? Would it merely involve greater coercive state interventions by mental health and health institutions, child protection systems and welfare authorities, and white controls over education, controls by corporations and property regimes? In Foucault's critique of the disciplinary society, he regards all these expressions of sovereignty, including prisons, hospitals, asylums and schools, as evenly powerful. An emphasis on emancipation from prison can reinforce the sense that oppression happens within or primarily from penal systems. Post-colonial scholar Harry Blagg, as well as anti-prison Indigenous activists, emphasise that there are prisons outside of prison walls for First Peoples, and we need to challenge not only prisons but settler-colonial relations. They regard prisons in Australia as one but a range of sites where various colonial techniques of subordination and control are deployed. Other post-colonial techniques of the state and corporations can be just as powerful in breaking up families, displacing Indigenous peoples from their lands and removing their basic rights. In a piece I'm writing with Harry Blagg, we draw on Foucault to argue that the prison that rather than the prison being the exemplar of disciplinary power that spills over into other disciplinary sites, discipline is actually dispersed across these sites. First Peoples and colonial systems blur divisions between institutions. For example, places of employment, such as Virginia mentioned today with cattle stations, weren't simply like prisons, they were prisons with supplemented corporal punishment. But at the same time, we critically appraise Foucault's Eurocentric notion that power is omnipresent and constantly reproduced, including in resistance. Foucault's Western approach does not look to the settler colonies of the global south, where Indigenous ontologies deflect disciplinary power. As post-colonial theorist Ranajit Guha recognises, the colonial hegemony has not been realised because Indigenous peoples retain their ways of knowing and doing, notwithstanding the colonial state's domination. But Foucault cannot see beyond this Western disciplinary framework. So in our paper today, Juanita and I are not arguing that criminologists necessarily adopt an inter, multi or transdisciplinary approach. After all, Western positivism and its colonial discourses can be embedded in these disciplines as much as in a transdisciplinary approach. All of them rely on the reproduction and development of these colonial discourses. Juanita's work at the University of Sydney through the National Centre for Cultural Competence is highly cognizant of how disciplines across universities have reproduced the same learning about Indigenous nations. Rather, what we propose is a transdisciplinary approach that is decolonising in its focus. We're seeking to develop research that recognises an alternative epistemology and a methodology that is grounded in Indigenous ways of knowing and doing, and refracts Western knowledge systems, including those in disciplinary branches such as criminology. So we do this through adopting an approach that's responsive to Indigenous research priorities and needs for change, as well as their channels for change, including in strengthening Indigenous research capacities, organisations, healing strategies and activism. It doesn't deny that at the front and centre of Indigenous concerns may be criminology's concerns, or at least critical criminology's concerns, with over-policing, deaths in custody, strip searches in prisons, but it doesn't limit its inquiry to criminological frameworks. We also recognise that while interdisciplinarity isn't a necessary prerequisite of post-disciplinary research, it often makes sense to draw on several disciplinary branches because this reflects how people live their lives and experience society. We find natural allies, I think, in criminology outside of criminology, including in health, geography, environmental studies, archaeology, political economy, communication and education, that help us better respond to the likely concerns raised in research with Indigenous communities. However, we can still do, I think, as BICO has challenged us to do, good work within critical criminology, as long as we're conscious of the need for transgressive research that pushes the limitations imposed by the discipline, and resists the fact that we are otherwise walking, talking records of our discipline, being aware of this and being self-critical. Unsurprisingly, criminology has come relatively late to discussions on post-disciplinarity, and I think this is because of its inwardness. Cultural studies, for example, emerged in the 1960s in the UK with a very strong sense of post-disciplinarity and resistance to Western knowledges. And we saw student and staff protests at Sydney University in the 1970s pushing back on the rationalism of economics, a bit like the rationalism of criminology, and a split from the economics department there. Juanita and I specifically identify the need for a decolonising post-disciplinary approach, which blurs disciplinary boundaries and undermines knowledge systems. It refocuses attention from Indigenous discipline to Indigenous wellbeing. We seek to recognise and value Indigenous knowledge systems in this project. And I think it's really illuminating that there are people here today, including Juanita, who work in Indigenous centres that are invariably post-disciplinary. They don't draw on one discipline, but their role is to challenge Western approaches and work within Indigenous epistemologies and methodologies. And these centres weren't forged from the goodwill of white universities. They were developed from the activism and struggles of Indigenous people within those universities. Just to end on, I want to say that our approach isn't theoretical, it's highly practical. It involves listening and working outside of our constrained inquiries in criminology, but also within universities, and rather fostering communities of strength through our research, fostering communities of empowerment, support, healing, and using our research to develop the capacity of Indigenous communities and organisations in how they can do the work of Indigenous safety, injury prevention, wellbeing and self-determination. And I think Juanita models this type of research activity, and we continue to try and do this through our work with the Tangentyere Council in Central Australia, which we'll talk about. In doing this work, we step outside our disciplinary boundaries that are tied to institutional knowledges and methods and break down barriers between language and practice and between researchers and participants, and recognise that research is practice and Indigenous participants are themselves expert researchers, and we as researchers are participants in change.
Thanks. Thank you. I'd just like to acknowledge the country we're on today, the land of the Wurundjeri people, and I'd like to acknowledge everybody here today. Sorry, nervous. I just want to step back a little bit and say that I'm from the Wiradjuri Nation of New South Wales, and I'd like to pay my respects to everybody here. And I would like to say that decolonisation unsettles everyone, and that has been my aim, is to unsettle the spaces that I've had to work within. I guess I'd really like to start with a place that really took me to look at how important decolonising criminology and law was. And I'd like to also acknowledge that I'm working with a fantastic non-Indigenous woman who is we are a working team, and this is what we should be working towards, I believe, is improving and shifting and changing these spaces, and this is decolonisation in action. I come from with a health and education background, and I was very fortunate to be a child and family health nurse on the block in Redfern. And it was there as a child and family health nurse that I did a lot of work with young children on the block with otitis media. This is an ear disease that is really common, and I've just been to a conference in Western Australia this week again on otitis media, a health-related issue that affects your life chances and education. We have looked at prisons in Alice Springs and Darwin where 95% and 90% of inmates have otitis media. Now, this is an important story for me because this is something I really fought hard to get recognised within the health and education spectrum. And I guess this is the transdisciplinary perspective which I'm trying to bring to this conversation, is that health and education got it. Education went, oh my goodness, if you can't hear, you can't learn. But health didn't. I fought with health for 10 years trying to get them to listen, joke, around if you can't hear, you can't learn. That had no meaning to the health professionals that I worked with. It was just like, oh, it's okay. Children, Aboriginal children, yes, they've had a hearing loss for a long time, but you know, what's the significance of this? And fortunately, this is where my research started. I guess I didn't realise it was a decolonising space, but I was certainly disruptive. And I went to the community and said, listen, I know this is a really big problem, we need to do something about it. We contacted an organisation called Menzies School of Health Research in Darwin, who came down straight away and said, yes, we'll show you how to do some research and we'll work with your community and we'll do this research with your community. And so we did a basic screening of all schools, Redfern, Alexandria and Erskineville in Redfern. And we found in those schools that we had a significant hearing loss, like 85% of the children in these schools had an educational significant hearing loss, which was highly problematic. They were, and again, health wasn't at all flummeted or concerned about this issue. And I knew from an educational perspective, and I knew from a health perspective, that this was problematic. I knew through sending children to health services to try and get medication and treatment for their hearing, that it was working for some kids and it wasn't working for others. And parents were being blamed for their children not recovering. And today, just this week, I heard from Menzies School of Health Research, we don't know why we've got such high rates of otitis media in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community. I'd like to say I can tell you why. Trauma. We've had trauma, intergenerational trauma, and I wanted to raise this issue again. It's been a historical impact of trauma. It has had an ongoing impact, and it has implications on our immune system. We know the physiology of stress, ongoing trauma, has significant implications on how you fight infection. And until we recognise that we have serious health-related issues which are getting worse, as we've been seeing, mortality and morbidity, that these have definite consequences related to this idea of trauma and the way that, I guess, the surveillance of organisations speak to us and talk to us and represent us and present us. And I think this is a really critical story. It's a critical story as I, as an Indigenous academic, have gone into the university setting trying to influence and inform many faculties that you need to know that we're on an Aboriginal country, that we've never ceded our sovereignty, that this land has always been Aboriginal people's land, and that you need to be respectful of the First Nation people of this country. And then we need to start working with and respecting all ways of knowing and being and doing. Another ideology that I think really needs to be brought into this conversation around decolonising criminology is the acknowledgement of Indigenous knowledge systems and the power that they have to transform the world for everybody's benefit. So I have already just told you I am very subjective in this space. I'm stating my positionality, which is another thing that I do as an Aboriginal person, because I want you to know that I am subjective and I don't believe in objectivity. So I don't believe in hiding behind my numbers, although, and as has been said, Maggie Walters does a very good job, and she doesn't hide behind her numbers. She actually is very clear in that space. But I think I really want to highlight that we do need to express our perspective and our history. Now, the reason I told you about otitis media was I want to tell you about what I observed on the block in Redfern. My kids that I had screened with otitis media were kids that were suffering in the classroom environment. They got treated quite badly because no one knew that they had a hearing loss. They were seen as a kid playing up. They were seen as kids with problems. And they were kids that were sent home early. And then because they were home early or walking home early, guess who was out there ready to swamp them? The police. The police were ready to growl, the police were ready to hinder, harass and label these kids. And these kids had taken on, I'm not doing great in school and now I'm doing not as well outside, I'm getting harassed by everyone, I'm taking on that pain that you were telling us about this morning. They took this on, and this is an issue. This was something that I could see, and we were trying to do something about it with the police. 20 years later down the track, I'm working on Scream, a project with Aboriginal mothers inside. They're the mothers, their mums, they are the women that I actually worked with 20 years ago with otitis media. They remember me as their auntie, and I remember them sadly thinking, oh my God, this is not what I wanted to see. I did so much work to try and stop this happening. Sorry, now I'm teary. Yeah. This is, we do have to decolonise this stuff. We have to shift and change this space because it is doing damage. And I have to say, the women, the brave women I met inside, whose children have been taken from them, this is another sad story. Those kids are 4 times to 8 times more likely to be part of the system of ending up inside because of their institutionalisation and because of the lack of care and trauma they receive in this space and place. So I'm going to jump into my methodology. So,
maybe show some cartoons.
Yeah. Do you want to show the cartoons? So, the reason I'm doing decolonising methodologies is because I want to fight this system, and I think they offer hope of shifting the research paradigm and our positions of being framed with a Western worldview as problematic. Through the utilisation of our Indigenous research methodologies, privileging Indigenous ways of knowing, being and doing, we become the brokers of our solutions, self-determining our ways forward and decolonising our representations and hence our minds. The framework I explore is complex and requires that research and researchers and institutions acknowledge that we are experts in our ways of being and knowing and doing, and that we do not need to continuously be historically contrived as problematic. I think decolonisation is a discourse for reclaiming knowledges informed through a balance of truths. We haven't talked a lot about truths today, but I think with our Indigenous ways of knowing, we talk about many ways of knowing and being and doing, which means many truths. We are not stuck in a positivist framework of saying, yes, there's a right and there's a wrong. We talk about balance and sustainability. So, and I think that's important that we continue that. Now, I guess why I went back to talking about my positionality is that we've been stuck with a universal truth about our problematizing and our criminality. And I guess this morning I tried to raise that, as I have seen in the health avenue, and I'm quite involved also in the corrections space, is that we continue to view people inside as the problem. We don't see how our system actually perpetuates that the people that are in there aren't necessarily offenders. They were innocent. There are so many women that I have met and so many young people that I've met who have been captured by a system that's been negligent because it hasn't acknowledged their rights. It hasn't acknowledged the stories that they have come with. And it fails to listen to those with experience and knowledge about their culture and their communities. It's only those who have wealth that are able to walk away from that system. The blue collar crime is something that we hear about often, and those people get away with it. We get criminalised for just resisting, and that resistance is existing. And that existence, we are surviving and we're strong, and through our taking on of decolonising methodologies, will show that we can critique this space. Yeah.
Okay, we just want to finish by focusing on some of the differences between traditional criminology approaches and post-disciplinary decolonising approaches, particularly through the work we do with Tangentyere. So kind of shifting...
Do you want to explain where Tangentyere is?
Well, Tangentyere is a council, an Aboriginal control council in Alice Springs. It actually was formed to address housing issues, particularly the town camps that exist on the margins. Going into a town camp is like walking into another nation. It has none of the features of the white suburbs in Alice Springs. And so Tangentyere was a voice for housing, but has gone on to do a lot of really good work in terms of safety. It does work with Aboriginal night patrols. So it's an empowered organisation that doesn't impose any, I guess, of the disciplinary boundaries we're used to. And Juanita and I reached out to them in our current project because they have a research hub, so they know about right way research
For their people.
For their people, with their people. And Juanita was involved in setting up that research hub. And basically we were of the view when we started research in Central Australia that local Aboriginal people affected by this research had to have control of it. So a lot of our research funding is not on us as researchers, but on building their research capacity. Did you want to add to that?
Yep, no,
so some of the questions, for example, the criminologists pose are what causes offending and how can the state fix offenders, especially Indigenous offenders, whereas the focus of the Indigenous researchers we work with and the questions we ask are about how can First Nations people develop the capacity to work towards preventing injury, enhancing resilience, well-being and self-determination. And for them, they know the problems better than any outside researcher and have the solutions, but need the capacity
to articulate it in a way that is translatable to the community and to the broader stakeholder group.
Yeah. So the criminology's research focus is often on the strengths of the state how its position of power can, again, fix problems and the role of policy, and in contrast, the problems of criminals. Whereas post-disciplinary decolonising approaches look at the strengths of First Nations and contrast that with the problems of the state, the pathology of the state response. Researchers in criminology tend to come from institutions, obviously tend to be white, whereas a post-disciplinary approach has local Indigenous organisations working side by side with these institutions. And Juanita was involved in a trial, an evaluation of the grog trials, which were restrictions in Alice Springs in 2003. And the approach of the
Northern Territory Health Department.
Yeah, the department and the Liquor Commission was to employ, contract out to a group called Market Equity, their research, and what they did was get white people to make telephone calls to Alice Springs residents randomly, whereas the approach of Tangentyere, working with academics, was to go out to town camps to make sure every single household was engaged and not only asking direct questions but empowering them to set the research agenda.
And the way to have it translated back to community as well.
Chris referred to this previously, but the approach to ethics is very different as well. Criminologists look at risks of individuals. It's deficit-based, seeing individuals as vulnerable, particularly Indigenous people, whereas post-disciplinary approaches, and we work particularly with Congress, the Aboriginal Health Organisation in Alice Springs, is to identify what Indigenous strengths are and how the research will build those capacities and benefit communities. Research process and outcomes is quite functional in criminology, wanting to have answers to very narrow questions, and the relationships are very short term, whereas decolonising approaches are based on strong, pre-existing relationships, building those, searching for holistic findings that are relevant to what the community and the community researchers are concerned with.
I do want to go back to this because this, from my work in SCREAM and my continuing work in community, this is the issue. There is a lot of trauma and there's a lot of unwellness in our communities, and we do need some healing, and this is a priority. So let's stop building prisons and let's start training Indigenous health and non-Indigenous health professionals who get social emotional wellbeing and healing for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. That's it.
I think that's great.
I've got one specific question for Juanita. In this project that you talked about, the hearing loss and the kids were sent home early, I noticed that there was one particular element of this, and this was that the teachers sent those kids home instead of asking, why is this kid being disruptive? So how much of this project actually dealt with the low expectations that the teachers had of these specific kids anyway, because that's the underlying issue, right?
Yeah.
They had these low expectations,
Yeah.
and that's why they sent them home.
Absolutely. It's the cycle of problematisation. And it wasn't until I walked up with evidence to teachers and said, hey, listen, this is what this child can actually hear, once I put together. And a lot of some teachers were horrified and absolutely shocked that the kids that they were growling had a problem. And same with parents. I took these tests back to parents, and parents went, oh no, I had no idea my child wasn't hearing well. I just thought they were being naughty. And the parents weren't expecting that, but some of the teachers were, as you said. And it was the problematisation, and again, the internalisation of the problematisation.
But that's what I'm asking.
Yes.
Was that underlying issue addressed from their side? Why did they not ask, is there an underlying health issue?
I can be very blatant about that and say, there's institutional racism.
Thank you. I think that's the big part in it, that you can do at one end a lot of good work, but as you said, the kids ended up in the same space that you didn't want them in up in. And I think that's actually the reason.
Yes.
That no matter how many projects you can do, or how many projects you do, and this is what William Wood said in his article, right? As long as the structural injustices are not addressed, no restorative justice process will achieve anything. And I applaud you for your work on the ground, but it's frustrating as hell that these things are, ramping up against institutional racism.
I guess what's really important is, though, there's about another 20 people out there that are behind me to make a difference now. I mean, I think there's a lot of people who are trying to make a change. And yes, the institutional racism's still there. And that's why I'm now working in the National Centre for Cultural Competence, which is about going, hey guys, it's not okay to think this way anymore. You really need to own your unconscious bias, your prejudice, your own culture. Yes, and you got one. And this is where I'm at now. So I'm hoping that we will challenge people's thinking around how they actually work in this space.
Chris? Yeah, it's just a question about the last couple of slides you had about criminology and post-disciplinary decolonising approaches. I just wondered whether you should think, and this is self-criticism as well, because one and I tend to have this problem of slippage as well. That, criminology is not a singular discipline. And if you had Marxist criminology, if you had human rights criminology, critical race criminology, feminist criminology up there, you'd have a different set of questions. And whether it's really, what at times we refer to as authoritarian criminology, or other times we refer to it as administrative criminology.
Or positivist.
Or at times we just forget about it and just say criminology. But I think,
we really mean authoritarian.
Yes,
and all the rest of you are nice.
Look, I think there's definitely ways of making criminology better, and I think that's why we're here, because we want to make our discipline better. But I also think it's worth pointing out that Indigenous ways of knowing and doing are quite different, and it's not to, and I was quite self-conscious because obviously I do fall within criminology a lot of the time, so I obviously am vulnerable to all of that, but I think it's just being mindful of different ways of doing things and
the power of that dominance. I mean, there is dominance in that space, and it is the Western model, and I think even though you can give it and articulate it, it is powerfully important to acknowledge that it is the dominant model of questioning us.
Yeah, but I agree. There's lots of kind of layers between that, and it's probably the best and the worst of each of them.
Just one more question. Yes.
Similar to the question I was going to ask earlier, if you were saying before that the system is the criminal, so can you comment about just the colour of your skin and how in the Australian context, being black, what impact does that have? Like, I'm just conscious of the speaker before talking about, black women in the UK not needing to have offended before the law is applied to them in a punitive way.
Same here.
Can you comment on that, about colour of skin in Australia in the criminal justice system?
I guess it's not just the colour of the skin, it's where you live, it's the environment, and I guess I really can clearly, living and working in Redfern, I saw that if you lived in Redfern, it didn't matter what colour your skin was, but you were connected to a community, you were in trouble. And I saw kids as young as 8 starting to be harassed, and you build a contingency of fines that you eventually either go to JJ with, and then you graduate into prison later down the track. And that's definitely without having done a thing apart from answering back to a rude pig. That's often the outcome. Yeah.
Well, could you please join me in thanking? Oh, sorry. Very quick. Hold on, sorry. Just very quickly.
Just one last question. In terms of that overarching system, if we're at a grassroots community level and we're like, because we have like landscape, what overarching legislation and policy, the main ones are there, so that we can maintain self-determination and control over our social justice advocacy goals and stuff? And this research that you're saying we're coming from the bottom up, what can we grab onto to help us?
I think-
We're being pushed aside.
Well, I think we have to use all our organisations. I mean, it is health, it is education, it is law, it's the Land Council, it's all of those organisations. We've got to, raise our voices in those spaces.
In regards to those knowledge bases though, that are specific to land, so particularly like here, the
Yep.
land that we're on, the descendants of those people are entitled to pass on their culture, as far as I understand what human rights models are there. And then, that's what I'm trying to find is where are those concrete legal mechanisms for us?
The UN. Sorry,
Although it
that's
has its own imperial. Yeah. And look, I think I think that's where you kind of need to talk about self-determination, and probably as researchers there's this tendency to want to give a solution.
And I don't want to answer I don't have the answer for everything either. I mean, and I hope that that's not being impolite, but I don't have the answer for everything.
And just to say, if we are talking about international models, I would probably suggest those international organisations can be very imperialist, but certainly the Indigenous Forum is an alternative to that in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and I think that they're definitely the kind of aspirational, documents to look towards in terms of the rights of Indigenous peoples.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Juan.
This is Juanita.